There is a very specific kind of panic that doesn't announce itself loudly. It doesn't look like a crash or a crisis. It shows up quietly in the routines you depend on. In the checkout line on a receipt that suddenly feels unfamiliar. In the creeping realization that the system you rely on to make life affordable may no longer be willing or able to do that job. And sometimes that panic has a source, not a recession, not a market collapse, but the possibility that the most powerful retailer in the country is quietly deciding that serving you is no longer worth the cost. For decades, there was an unspoken deal in the American economy. You didn't need to understand trade policy or supply chains. You just needed to trust that the shelves would stay full and the prices would stay low. That deal had a name, and it sat at the edge of nearly every town in America. If you want to understand what is really happening to your cost of living before it shows up permanently on your receipt, stay with me. Because this story isn't about politics. It's about math. And that math is starting to fail. For a long time, we've been trained to think about the economy as something abstract. Lines on a chart, numbers read aloud by people in suits. But the economy you and I actually live in doesn't exist on a graph. It exists in physical space, in milk, in tires, in the place where statistically more Americans buy their groceries than anywhere else on Earth. Walmart is not just a store. It is infrastructure. It is the pressure valve that has kept the cost of living from exploding for millions of families. And for decades, its role was simple. Build the biggest logistics machine in human history, squeeze every inefficiency out of the global supply chain, and in return, keep prices predictably low. That was the deal. That was the foundation of modern American consumer life. So when we see credible signals that this system is starting to fracture, not because demand disappeared, not because logistics failed, but because government policy changed the math, we are not looking at a retail story. We are looking at a stress test of the entire economic model that props up daily life, and it is already cracking. To understand why this moment feels so unstable, you have to rewind the clock, not years, but decades. What we are seeing now is not a sudden failure. It is the delayed consequence of a very specific bargain that defined the last 40 years of American economic life. We allowed domestic manufacturing to hollow out. Factories closed. Jobs moved overseas. And in exchange, Americans were promised something else. Abundance. An endless river of cheap goods flowing in from across the world. You might not make the microwave anymore, but you could buy one for $40. That was the trade-off. And it wasn't accidental, it was policy. This system required one thing above all else: frictionless trade. Containers moving freely, borders that functioned as checkpoints, not toll booths, and no company embodied that system more perfectly than Walmart. It became the physical expression of globalization, moving goods from distant factories into American homes with ruthless efficiency. But that machine only works if the political consensus supporting it remains intact. And that consensus is now being deliberately dismantled. Which brings us to the first real break in the system and the moment when the warning lights began flashing. The first crack didn't come with sirens. It came wrapped in policy language. When the administration launched its initial round of trade wars, it was framed as a test of strength. Steel, aluminum, a handful of targeted sectors. Disruptive, yes, but survivable. Companies adjusted. Walmart hedged. Suppliers were squeezed. The machine groaned, but it kept moving. This time is different. What we are seeing now is not a skirmish. It is escalation. Broad tariffs, blanket policies. A worldview that treats every incoming shipment not as commerce, but as an invasion. And that shift matters, because when tariffs stop being surgical and start becoming universal, they stop being leverage and start becoming gravity. In a Walmart boardroom, this isn't ideology, it's arithmetic. A tariff is not paid by a foreign country. It is paid at the border, by the importer, by Walmart, on goods with margins so thin that even a small tax wipes out profitability. If you're wondering why this matters to you, Stay with me, because this is the moment where policy stops being theoretical and starts rewriting the price tags in your life. And once the math breaks, the consequences move fast. This is the part that gets lost in political shouting, because it's boring and because it's devastating. Walmart does not survive on high margins. It survives on scale. Pennies per item multiplied by billions of transactions. That is the entire engine. So when you hear about a tariff that sounds small, 10%, 20%, it doesn't land gently inside that system. It hits like a wrecking ball. Take a $5 item. The profit on that item might be measured in cents. Add even $1 in tariff cost, and the profit doesn't shrink, it disappears, the sale turns into a loss. Multiply that across tens of thousands of products, and the business model stops functioning. Not eventually, immediately. At that point, there are only two choices: raise prices and abandon the promise that made Walmart Walmart, or stop prioritizing the market where the government has decided to tax inventory instead of profits. This is the hidden mechanism. Tariffs don't just increase prices, they change incentives. They quietly tell global companies where growth is welcome and where it is being punished. And once incentives shift, capital follows. Which leads directly to the second crisis, because when the math stops working, companies don't argue, they move. This is where the story stops being theoretical and starts becoming irreversible. Because once a company like Walmart decides that a market no longer makes economic sense, it does not wait for permission. It does not wait for elections. It reallocates. This is the moment when adjustment turns into retreat. Instead of asking how to absorb higher costs in the United States, the question shifts to where those costs don't exist, where goods can still move freely, where margins still function, where policy is predictable. And when Walmart looks at that map, it sees alternatives: Mexico, India, Southeast Asia, Europe. Markets where importing a toaster does not come with a political penalty. That pivot doesn't require closing every store overnight. It happens quietly. Fewer low-margin products, less inventory risk, more automation, slower expansion, capital redirected elsewhere. And each of those decisions is rational in isolation. Together, they amount to a withdrawal. This is the second crisis. Not empty shelves yet, not panic yet, but a slow constriction, a narrowing of choice, a subtle but permanent shift away from serving the most price-sensitive American consumers. And once that shift begins, it doesn't reverse easily, because the next question is no longer about Walmart. It's about what this does to the people who rely on it to survive. This is the point where the story stops being about corporations and starts being about you. Because when prices rise at the margins, they don't hurt everyone equally. If you have savings, flexibility, options, you feel irritation. If you don't, you feel pressure. And for millions of families, Walmart isn't a convenience. It's the line between getting by and falling behind. If you are earning under $50,000 a year, price stability isn't a bonus, it's survival. A few extra dollars on groceries isn't noise, it's a decision. Milk or gas, shoes or medicine, today or tomorrow. And when tariffs quietly push costs upward, that pressure lands directly on your kitchen table. This is what economists call a regressive tax, a policy that hits hardest where there is the least room to absorb it. And the cruel irony is that the system being disrupted was built to serve exactly the people now being squeezed. If this feels personal, it should, because the consequences don't arrive as headlines, they arrive as receipts. And if you want to understand why your life is getting more expensive without getting better, stay with me. Because this pressure doesn't stop at your town, it radiates outward. What starts as a domestic policy choice never stays domestic for long. Global supply chains don't reroute politely. They snap to new centers of gravity. And when a company as large as Walmart begins shifting capital, inventory, and attention away from the United States, that decision sends shockwaves far beyond American borders. Manufacturing doesn't wait. It flows toward certainty, toward governments that signal stability instead of volatility, toward markets that reward trade instead of punishing it. As U.S. tariffs rise, other countries don't just absorb the displaced goods, they absorb the investment, the innovation, and eventually the consumer focus that once pointed toward American households. This is how economic influence erodes quietly. Not through collapse, but through replacement. New trade corridors form. New logistics hubs emerge. New consumers become the priority. And the United States, once the default destination for global goods, starts to look like a complicated outlier. The danger here isn't isolation, it's irrelevance. When global systems adapt without you, they don't rush back when you change your mind. And that shift doesn't just affect prices, it affects power. Which brings us to the future, because from here, the path splits, and none of the options are neutral. From here, the future doesn't unfold as a single outcome. It fractures into paths, each shaped by how long this policy environment lasts and how deeply it hardens. The best case scenario is partial retreat. Tariffs are softened, exceptions multiply, companies like Walmart adapt just enough to keep the U.S. market functional, though permanently more expensive. Prices stabilize at a higher baseline. Choice narrows. The pain doesn't disappear, it becomes normalized. The middle path is stagnation, tariffs remain, investment slows, Walmart and others continue reallocating growth elsewhere. The U.S. consumer becomes a legacy market, large, necessary, but no longer prioritized. Goods arrive later, cost more. Innovation targets someone else first. Life gets incrementally harder, year by year. The worst case scenario is decoupling. Trade hardens into blocks. Supply chains reroute permanently. Walmart doesn't leave, but it stops trying. Low-margin goods vanish. Automation replaces labor. Entire regions hollow out. The consumer economy shifts from abundance to rationing by price. What matters is this. None of these futures restore the old deal. Once the math breaks, it doesn't quietly heal. Systems remember, capital remembers. And the longer uncertainty lasts, the more irreversible the damage becomes. Which brings us to the final question: who pays when the system resets, and who gets to pretend this was unavoidable? When this story is told later, it will not be framed as a choice. It will be framed as fate. Prices went up, shelves thinned out, companies made decisions. That is how accountability disappears. But none of this is accidental. This is not weather. It is architecture. An economy does exactly what it is designed to do. And right now, it is being redesigned to make everyday life more expensive in the name of political toughness. The cost doesn't show up on a ballot. It shows up on your receipt. Quietly, relentlessly, and always after the cameras have moved on. Walmart didn't break the deal. It is responding to the fact that the deal was rewritten without regard for the math that made it work. And when math loses, symbolism doesn't save you. It just sends the bill somewhere else. So the question isn't whether prices will rise. They already are. The question is whether we continue pretending this is strength, or whether we finally admit that an economy built on scarcity punishes the people least able to absorb it. If you want to understand where this leads next, and who benefits when systems fail quietly, stay here. Because this story doesn't end at the register, it's just getting started.